up, everyone? Welcome to Young Bright Chats, also known as YBC Podcast. And we are your hosts who will be with you throughout the entire podcast.
I'm Matna.
And I'm Abdulshakur Abdullah.
In this podcast, we talk with various young leaders, entrepreneurs, and activists in Tanzania. So buckle up, grab your paper and pen, and get ready to dive into a world full of skills, knowledge, ideas, and many more from our young changemakers in Tanzania. Let's go!
Welcome to today's episode, and I'm your host, Abdulshakur. And in this episode, this is a special episode, by the way, and this is for a new month of December, and we'll get to learn three things, basically. And the first thing is we'll get to see the idea of podcasting, how it came to evolution, and how is it right now. But also, we'll get to see the benefits of listening to podcasts. What can you get while listening to podcasts? But also, we'll go over what we are going to do during December, and we want you to know what to expect from this month of December, to know what are going to happen. And we have a really special thing that is going to happen in the middle of the month. And yeah, so we'll also take a look of why do you think you don't listen to podcasts, and this is the question that we are going to answer at the end. Starting with podcast history, the word podcast originates from iPod and broadcast. It's like broadcasting from iPods, and this was between 2004 September. This is when the word was introduced, and before that, podcasts were known as audio blogs, or some people called it on-demand radios that listeners could download online audios and listen to them at any time they wanted. In 2014 to 2018, the industry got popularity, and it was through this time that many podcasters started to establish their podcast, and how the awareness of podcasting came to many people during this time. And to the podcasts usually have episodic content, but also with a consistent structure that a certain podcaster follows, so that it shows their uniqueness, but also they show their uniqueness, but also this is the way that someone can recognize the podcast. Going along and to see the benefits that someone can get from listening to podcasts, because we all understand that listening to podcasts is really a great thing that someone can do, and there are a lot of benefits that they can get, as the study shows that 81% of podcast listeners, they listen because they want to have something to listen to when they are doing something. Maybe when they're working out at the gym, or maybe they are driving, or they are riding a bike, or they are mowing the lawns. This is the time that 81% people answered that they listen to podcasts. But 88% of podcast listeners say that they listen to podcasts because they want to learn something. They found podcasts to be the very simple way to learn something, and this is talking about economically, but also talking about with time, so that when you listen to podcasts, you can learn, but at the same time, you can do other things. And 87% of listeners say that they are listening to podcasts because they want to be entertained, and they think that they find a really good content in the podcast for them to get entertained. So from this, we're going to look further into it and see how can you get benefits from podcasts, either to be entertained or either to learn something, but also to just have something to listen to when you're doing your things. Podcasts can provide knowledge. This knowledge can be of school stuff, but also something that you're passionate about, but also something that you really want to learn, but you maybe don't have classes about that in your school or university, but something that you want to learn, but you don't want to take the degree. As we said, that 87% of people listen to podcasts so that they can be entertained. Also, you can get entertainment like comedies, but also you can learn new skills if you enjoy learning new skills, and this can entertain you. But also through critical thinking, you can learn to critically think, and this can be entertaining. But you can explore places that maybe you won't have time and resources to visit, but you can learn about things that are over there through podcasts, and you can go to specific podcasts that talk about traveling maybe, and you can explore those places while at your home or at your office desk. Also, podcast is among the uh, best places where you can get inspiration, and inspiration can be of hardworking, but also of getting new ideas. And also, people use podcasting to get free coaching because you can get a person who coaches people maybe on doing well on leadership. You can get new ideas from listening to podcasts. So if you want to get new ideas or you don't know what to do in your free time, listening to podcasts can give you an insight of what you should do. But also working hard, and as sometimes and most of the time, people usually love to be reminded on hardworking and to be motivated to work hard. So podcasts can be one of the best ideas that can remind you. You can download the motivation, listen to it every day, or you can follow the series of podcasts that remind people to work hard and to give strategies maybe to hard work and stuff like that. And podcast is a really good resource for that. Also, you can learn about news and politics, but also you can learn about science and technology. There are podcasts that give fictions, and all of those are found in all of these directories and these streaming platforms that you can use to listen to music, but also listening to podcasts may be an option and a very good option, to be honest. But podcasts can also help you to learn about the history, but also stories like true crimes and other stories are also available in podcasts. So you can see that podcast involves a lot of things and a lot of topics that you can explore. And most of the time, every podcast relates itself to very specific type of topics that they talk about. So it's easy for you to go along your interests and to learn about your interests. Although we know that there are so many advantages that have been observed in podcasts, as we mentioned, the things that we said, some of them people pay money to go and get them, like free coaching you get in the podcast, but to get a physical coach, you have to pay money. And still, it has been an unfortunate that youth, especially here, do not even know what a podcast is. And even if they do, they just don't listen to. And it's very easy to listen to podcasts because you can just download it and listen to it at any time you want. And you can learn a lot of things. To be honest, I would say the first reason I would say why people don't listen to podcasts, especially youth, the first thing is maybe because youth are unaware of podcasts, but also maybe they just don't know where to get the podcast. And it's very important that we keep some of our time to teach youth how what is podcast and how does it work. Podcasts normally you can find them on Spotify, you can find them on Apple Podcasts, you can find them on Google Podcasts, and many streaming directories or streaming platforms and networks. You can find them, but to make them easier, nowadays you can find podcasts on YouTube even, and you can listen to them at any time you want by downloading them and listening to them. What to do when you're listening to podcasts? This is very important. And as I say, podcast is just a simple way to learn about things because you can listen to podcasts, but also you can do other things. So one of the things that you can do is you can be, first of all, make sure you have a pen and a paper so that you can note down good ideas. But it's really important to have a diary or a notebook that you can keep your ideas flowing from days to days. And this is good because anything that you note down or you write down is easier to keep in your mind than something you just listen to. So it's important for you to take a piece of paper, or you can have a notebook. But while doing that, sometimes you just don't have time to um, give a full time to podcasts. You can also use your times that you think you can focus on podcasts, but also focus on doing whatever you're doing. Most of people use their working out time or their riding motorbikes time or the time that they are mowing the lawns. These are the times that they listen to podcasts. But also sometimes you can just wake up and after you're done with your exercises or your working out routines, you can listen to podcasts and it's very effective still. Just make sure you note down the ideas that you get from podcasts. We would like for you to give out your opinions when you listen to podcasts. What time does it really work out and what time does not, so that others can learn. So if you're listening from YouTube, you can comment, and if you're listening to Spotify or other platforms, then we have an option there that you can answer the questions. And now, as we promised for December, because this is a special episode, so for December, we will have one leadership episode and also we have one entrepreneurship episode because as we know that we are focusing on the three fields of leadership, entrepreneurship, and volunteerism. And also a special thing about this month is we'll have a book review and this will be released on the 19th of December. We'll share with you what book are we reviewing. So stay tuned and follow our social media to know about the book that we'll be reviewing. So to get one or all of these episodes, you just need to follow us on our social media and so that you can stay tuned and you can learn about all these episodes, but also to know when the books is being released and so that you can know which book we're going to review on the 19th of December. So stay tuned and make sure you follow us on our Instagram, on our TikTok, but also subscribe on our YouTube channel. All of those you can get under the username ybc.podcast. That is ybc.podcast. And thank you so much. And this will be the end of this episode. And make sure that you tag along on our next episodes. And if you have any person, as usual, who wants to be featured or who you want to be featured, give us their names or just DM us to feature them. And if you are the one, then to feature you. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to us.
That's it for today's episode. We would like to give lots of thanks to our listeners for being with us throughout the episode, and a huge shout out to our teammates Waridi and Jerome who helped keep this podcast going.
Are you interested in contributing or being featured in our podcast?
Contact us through our Instagram under ybc.podcast.
That is ybc.podcast. And folks, don't forget to tune into our next episode of YBC,
where young minds get filled with knowledge to impact the world.